We are told that the famous Suez Canal was built entirely by hand. A massive waterway, 120 miles long and 80 feet deep, constructed in just 10 years. But let's pause for a second and just use some basic logic. If you actually calculate what it takes to dig this from scratch, you would need to move over 133 million tons of solid earth. With 19th century technology, that means using wooden carts and baskets. That translates to 266 million trips with ordinary horse-drawn wagons. Let's break that down into a daily schedule for those 10 years. The builders would have needed to drive 3,000 fully loaded carts every single hour. That is 3,000 carts an hour, 24 hours a day, without a single break. No holidays, no weekends, no stopping for sleep or bad weather. Does that sound like a realistic human achievement or a mathematical impossibility? When you look closely at the official story, the cracks begin to show. The scale of the excavation simply doesn't match the tools they claim to use. And that brings us to the biggest paradox of all. Where did all that dirt go? Anyone who has ever dug a simple trench in their backyard knows the golden rule of digging. The dirt you dig out doesn't just magically disappear into thin air. If you dig a cubic meter of earth, you must have a cubic meter of earth lying right next to it. When they built the Moscow Metro in the 1930s, trains continuously hauled away massive mountains of soil. And those were just narrow tunnels deep underground. The Suez Canal is a giant trench wider than 3 football fields combined. It's as deep as an 8-story building and stretches for nearly 120 miles. If they dug this entirely from scratch through solid desert ground, there should be a continuous, massive mountain range of excavated dirt along both banks. A wall of soil at least 4 stories high, stretching the entire length of the canal. But if you go there today and look at the banks, what do you see? Nothing. The banks are perfectly flat, blending seamlessly into the surrounding desert. There are no colossal artificial mountains of excavated earth. Where did hundreds of millions of tons of dirt go? This isn't just a historical puzzle. It's a violation of the basic laws of physics. The official narrative insists that ordinary local workers with pickaxes did the heavy lifting. They say a few steam dredgers were brought in only at the very end of the project. Show this claim to any modern construction engineer, and they will laugh out loud. Imagine the logistical nightmare of keeping 45,000 manual laborers alive in the scorching desert. In the intense Egyptian heat, every worker would need at least 5 liters of fresh water daily. That is 270 tons of fresh drinking water that had to be transported every single day. And it had to be brought in from the Nile River, over 50 miles away. Where are the traces of this gargantuan supply chain? Where are the foundations of the massive worker barracks and supply depots? Where are the access roads used by millions of supply carts? Where are the massive graveyards? Mortality on such harsh projects was historically enormous. Yet, archaeological evidence of this massive, decade-long encampment is practically non-existent. The desert has swallowed the evidence, or perhaps, the evidence was never there to begin with. The sheer absence of physical infrastructure suggests a very different reality, a reality that historians have chosen to ignore. Then there is the glaring issue with the historical documentation. The construction of the Suez Canal was a mega-project funded by astronomical sums of money. In today's currency, we are talking about billions of dollars. With that level of expenditure, the French engineers should have left mountains of paperwork. There should be thousands of detailed blueprints, daily excavation logs, and financial audits. But in the public domain, comprehensive technical records of the actual digging are remarkably scarce. Even stranger is the lack of photographic evidence. Photography was already widely used during the Crimean War, years before the canal was supposedly dug. Yet, for the construction project of the century, we have almost no photos of the actual digging process. We only have a few staged photographs of the finished, or nearly finished, waterway. Why would you not photograph the greatest engineering triumph of your era? Unless, of course, what you were doing didn't look like digging from scratch. Unless you were simply clearing out something that was already there. This brings us to the biggest geological secret of the Sinai Peninsula. A secret that changes the entire story. The magic of the official story falls apart when you look at the local geology. The isthmus where the canal lies is conveniently divided into 3 distinct zones. The northern section is composed mostly of liquid mud, silt, and shallow swamps. The central section contains the Great Bitter Lakes. These were massive, dry salt basins that already sat well below sea level. And the southern section is filled with soft, yielding desert sand. The engineers didn't have to blast through miles of solid bedrock or granite mountains. The most shocking example is the Great Bitter Lakes region. When the French engineers finally dug a narrow trench connecting the lakes to the sea, they didn't have to excavate the massive basin. The water simply rushed in on its own. Gravity did the work. Over several months, nature flooded 25 miles of the canal's route. Billions of cubic meters of water filled the depression without a single worker lifting a shovel. Can we honestly call this building a canal from scratch? Hardly. They merely opened a valve to a pre-existing geographical bowl. It was a massive shortcut provided by the earth itself. Ancient historians like Herodotus and Strabo were not writing fairy tales. Over 500 years before Christ, Herodotus clearly described a functioning waterway in this exact location. Later Greek and Arab geographers repeatedly documented this canal as a real, working route. It was known as the Canal of the Pharaohs, connecting the Red Sea to the Nile. This means a massive canal existed here millennia before the 19th century French built it. Nature had already carved out the optimal path through the lowest points of the desert. Over thousands of years, this ancient waterway simply silted up and filled with loose sand. Cleaning out a soft, pre-existing riverbed is exponentially easier than digging a new one. When you excavate wet silt and mud, it dries out under the blazing sun. The water evaporates, the mud shrinks massively in volume, and it turns back into flat desert dust. This perfectly explains why there are no giant mountains of dirt on the banks today. The French in the 19th century didn't build the Suez Canal. They executed the largest janitorial cleanup operation in human history. They simply restored what an ancient, forgotten civilization had already perfected. They dredged the old path and claimed the glory. But there is another purely technical paradox that engineers immediately spot. The banks of the canal are made of extremely fine, loose desert sand. If you let massive ocean water flow through a trench of fine sand, and then you sail colossal ships through it, creating powerful wakes and waves, those sandy banks will rapidly absorb the water, turn to sludge, and collapse. Without modern reinforcement, a sand canal destroys itself in a single season. In 1869, they did not have reinforced concrete slabs to armor the miles of canal walls. So how did the newly opened canal survive without instantly collapsing under its own weight? Historians vaguely claim they constantly dredged the collapsing sand. But if they were constantly dredging collapsed sand for decades, where are the fresh piles of dirt? Again, the mathematics of the missing earth refuse to add up. The question hangs heavily in the dry desert air. Unless the core structure of the canal was already stabilized by something ancient beneath the sand. Something that modern dredging machines occasionally scrape against today. Which brings us to the darkest secret hidden beneath the water. During routine modern dredging operations to deepen the canal, machines constantly pull up anomalies. Massive, perfectly carved stone blocks, remnants of ancient, highly sophisticated masonry, pieces of antique pottery, and unknown metallurgical fragments. Egypt is a country that proudly showcases every single ancient shard found in the desert. Yet, the incredible architectural finds pulled from the bottom of the Suez Canal are kept quiet. No one is rushing to publish these underwater discoveries in major scientific journals. They are quietly moved away, locked up, and ignored by the mainstream academic community. Because acknowledging them would destroy the carefully crafted narrative of the 19th century. Why did the French, led by Ferdinand de Lesseps, rewrite history so aggressively? The answer is the oldest motivation in human history: geopolitical power and unimaginable wealth. The French company was granted a 99-year lease to collect astronomical tolls from every passing ship. Their legal claim was ironclad: we built this impossible canal from scratch in the empty desert. It belongs to us. If they admitted they merely cleaned out a massive ancient Egyptian ruin, their claim to own the most important waterway on Earth would have been legally void. History was rewritten not just for national ego, but for trillions of dollars in profit. When you strip away the romanticized myths and apply cold, hard engineering logic. 5 undeniable facts remain. First, the missing mountains of Earth prove they dredged ancient wet silt, not dry ground. Second, the mathematical reality of horse-drawn carts makes the 10-year timeline physically impossible. Third, nature itself flooded a third of the canal without human intervention. Fourth, ancient historians documented this exact waterway thousands of years before the French arrived. And fifth, the suppressed archaeological evidence beneath the waves points to an ancient origin. The Suez Canal is not the crowning achievement of 19th-century European engineering. It is the repurposed remnant of a much older, highly advanced civilization. A civilization that possessed the capability to manipulate planetary-scale water flows. We may not know exactly who originally carved this path through the desert, but we know the 19th-century builders simply dusted off the ancient blueprints and slapped their logo on it. And this phenomenon isn't limited to the sands of Egypt. Look around the old downtowns of your own cities. Massive buildings with grand windows mysteriously buried half underground. Colossal star forts, impossible granite embankments, and ancient bridges repurposed for modern trains. History is constantly being rewritten right under our feet, while we blindly watch the massive ships sail smoothly through the stolen canals of our ancestors.